introduced earlier, for those of you who were at the earlier session, Chloe is my consultant psychology colleague from the Nationally Specialist OCD, BDD and Related Disorder Service at the Maudsley Hospital in London. And Chloe is going to talk about OCD in children and young people, sort of reviewing some of the disorder and refreshing our understanding of the literature. Whilst Chloe's getting ready, she has a very distinguished career, and I would say there's probably no psychologist in the UK who has more experience than Chloe in treating children and young people with OCD and related disorders. So over to you, Chloe.
Hello, is that working? Yes. Thank you, Bruce, for that over-the-top introduction. I'm very, very excited to be here. This is my first visit ever to Egypt, and I feel very honoured to be here on such a special day for the development of child and adolescent mental health in Egypt. So thank you for having me. As Bruce mentioned, I'm going to be talking to you this morning fairly briefly, but trying to cover a fair amount in a short time. I've got my timer on, so I'm keeping a close eye on the time. But my plan is to cover the following. So I'm going to just very briefly kind of touch base on what we know about OCD, just to refresh people's memories. I'm going to touch on the evidence-based treatment, again, just to kind of recap on that. But I'm not going to go into a great deal of detail on that. If people are interested in learning more about the treatment of OCD, then Bruce and I are running a full-day workshop on Thursday to go into that, so there won't be a lot of detail in that in this short talk this morning. And then, just to finish off, I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of the research developments and innovations in treatment that we are involved with in our National Specialist Clinic in the UK. Things that we both get quite excited about, so that should be interesting. So, just a few facts about OCD. I'm sure many of you will be aware of these things. OCD is in fact the fourth most common mental disorder. About 12 in every 1,000 people, approximately 1.2% of the population, will suffer from OCD. And I think what's significant about that is it is the same across children and adults, which is not necessarily the case for other disorders. It's equally common in males and females and across all cultures. But what we have found is that different presentations may be more prevalent in different cultures. OCD has a way of latching on to what's important to people, to their perhaps very personal worst fears, or perhaps what's very important to them in their culture. So societies, for instance, that are very hold religion very dear to them may find that OCD latches on particularly to religious obsessions, for instance. The World Health Organization, WHO, has ranked OCD in the top 10 of the most disabling illnesses of any kind. I was quite struck by that, although not surprised when I've seen just the devastation that OCD can cause in its most severe form. But when you think of all the disabling illnesses, both physical and mental, that there are, to think that OCD is in the top 10, I think is quite striking. So just to recap, what is OCD? So it's made up of the two components of symptoms, the obsessions and the compulsions. The obsessions are frequent, intrusive, repetitive and unwelcome obsessional thoughts. And these are the triggers really that cause the increase in anxiety. I should point out though, I'm sure many of you have come across children who say they don't really have any obsessions, that it's more just it doesn't feel right. But we would classify that as an obsession. So there is a driving thought in there that causes the anxiety. And then that's followed by the compulsions, which are the behaviours, the repetitive physical or mental behaviours. They can be things that a young person's doing in their head, but they're also very often something that we can see them doing. And those are carried out in an attempt to reduce anxiety. So the OCD cycle, again, probably quite familiar to a lot of you, but just to take you through this with perhaps a very common example of OCD. So there might be a trigger. For instance, a young person might come across a door handle, a loose seat, something that they feel very, very anxious about because they might anticipate that that's got germs on it or that it's dirty, that object in itself might be the trigger, or the need to touch that object might be the trigger. And their head would then fill with worries and fears about getting germs on them, perhaps getting ill, perhaps dying, perhaps spreading those germs, whatever the way their OCD works in particular. That would cause an increase in anxiety. And in order to help them feel better, they will then take part in some sort of a compulsion. Now that might just involve avoiding touching that object, or it might involve touching it in the way that they have to, but then spending a very long time washing their hands afterwards. Sometimes to a really extreme degree, involving kind of using bleach, scrubbing with kind of iron, metal walls and things. It can be really, really extreme. And after doing those compulsions, they report that they feel relieved, but only temporarily, only until they next encounter another trigger. So that is the kind of vicious circle of OCD. I think the thing that I find most fascinating about OCD is just the incredibly wide variety of ways in which it can present. I know I've given the typical example of contamination, fear and hand washing. That is what a lot of people consider when they hear OCD. They think about hand washes, they think about checkers, they think about people lining things up. And yes, those are very common presentations of OCD. But when you work as we do, day in, day out with young people coming to us with obsessions and compulsions, they can be so bizarre and weird and strange, things that you could never imagine that a young person would develop as a fear. I had a boy once who was worried that his father had stolen some batteries from his workplace and had spent years obsessing about the fact that his dad was going to be caught by the police. He became obsessed with the idea there were little pieces of black battery paper wherever he was walking, and somehow that was evidence that his dad was going to be caught and put in jail. Now, you couldn't make that up. I mean, it is just extraordinary, the way that OCD will just latch on to a very particular fear and can actually drive a person's life and dominate that for years and years. And this boy was 11 when he started worrying about these things. We treated him, finally got to see us in the specialist service at the age of 17 and got the treatment that he needed. But for years that had been driving his life, basically. So the treatment for OCD is made up of two components: the evidence-based treatment, cognitive behaviour therapy, and medication, SSRIs. And there's a very strong evidence base for this treatment. So the NICE guidelines that were written in 2005, which are the National Institute of Care Excellence guidelines, which are based on the evidence that's already available, say very strongly that CBT, which needs to include a very important component, which I'll say a little bit more about, which is called ERP, Exposure and Response Prevention, is the first line of treatment for children and young people with OCD. And there's a very big evidence base, as I say, at least 10 or more randomized controlled trials of CBT, specifically in young people, with good outcomes. We ourselves have been involved in RCTs and did some follow-up research up to 12 years following up after treatment, and found, again, excellent response rates. So there really is good treatment for OCD, which does make it such a fantastic disorder to work with, because you're not just involved in the process of assessing and diagnosing. You really can give everybody that you see an immense amount of hope that they can really overcome this disorder. So exposure and response prevention, as I say, is a really key and active element in successful CBT for OCD. So what is ERP, or exposure and response prevention? So the exposure part, that's the deliberate exposure to all the avoided and anxiety-provoking situations. So that's when you would ask the young person to deliberately touch that dirty door handle, or to deliberately say the number 8, if number 8 was a number that they felt was bad or going to cause something bad to happen, or deliberately push a person even to the point where they might be so anxious about harming somebody that they've avoided contact with people for years and years. So you'd actually set up situations in which they had to kind of deliberately knock into somebody and realise that that was okay to do and tolerate that anxiety. So that's the sort of thing you're doing in exposure, setting up these deliberate tasks. And then the response prevention part, very importantly, is you don't just ask them to touch the door handle, you then say, and what you need to do now is not wash your hands. and then carry on with your daily routine, like eating or touching other personal items. So that's just a broad sweep of what ERP looks like. And the treatment for OCD is based primarily on the model of anxiety habituation, something that every human being, I would say, can relate to. This idea that when you first go into a situation that's anxiety-provoking, we all experience in new situations, the anxiety goes up, the heart starts racing, it feels kind of uncomfortable and difficult. But if we keep approaching those situations, so perhaps times when we, I don't know, children can relate to the idea of when they started a new school, or when they started a new club, and the first time they went, they felt very apprehensive and it was difficult. But with each repeated visit, it started to get easier. So usually young people can come up with good examples of where they've experienced anxiety habituation, and then you can map that on to the OCD treatment and explain to them that's all you're going to be doing, is you're going to be just taking these difficult things that OCD is making hard for you, approaching them one at a time, and gradually learning to tolerate that anxiety, and it will come down over time without you needing to do the response prevention. So that's just a list there of the different components in CBT. As I've said, exposure and response prevention is the absolute key part, but it has to be kind of scaffolded with all of these different components, and that is something that we'll be going into in quite a lot more detail on Thursday. And that's just a demonstration of how effective this treatment is. So those are our clinic outcomes from right back from 2007 up to 2016. And you can see that over time, that those scores are on the SIBOX, which is our measure that we use for assessing OCD and through treatment. And you can see that it started out in the kind of moderate to severe range, and that by the end of treatment and a 12-month follow-up, some of those young people were actually in the subclinical range, or at least in very low, mild range. So it's a very effective treatment. Medication for OCD is also an evidence-based treatment. I'm not going to dwell on this slide. Dr. Clark will talk more about this in our workshop on Thursday, but really just to stress that there are some really good, effective medications for OCD, and those are SSRIs, and they're listed there. This is just a study really that demonstrates the importance of the combination, in some cases, of medication and CBT. So there's two of these studies, the POTS 1 and the POTS 2. They're pediatric obsessive compulsive treatment studies. And the POTS 1 was CBT on its own or CBT with medication. And it was found that the combination of the two worked better. And the POTS 2 just went into a little bit more depth and did a combination of good going, kind of fully fledged CBT and medication. And then the other two conditions were medication with a kind of CBT light, a bit of a kind of brief CBT, and the third condition was just medication on its own. And you can see there that the line that drops right down is the combination of the two, so demonstrating that those two together will really enhance the CBT. So just coming on to some of the things that we're doing in the clinic at the moment and have been over a period of time. So we have a manualised treatment protocol which we have been developing over a number of years, and we're actually now on the brink of being able to bring that to publication, which is quite exciting. But it's a protocol that we are continually revising and reviewing and tweaking and really trying to get to be the most effective way of working with children and young people. But once it's published, we feel it'll be something that we can disseminate much more readily, not just across the country, but perhaps across the globe. We had a trial of telephone CBT versus face-to-face some time ago now, and it was found to be equally efficacious for two conditions. This is particularly important for us as a national clinic, because we see children and young people from all over the country. That can be several hours distance from the clinic. And so to be able to say to families, once we've assessed them, we say, well, look, we can offer you this treatment over the telephone, or in fact more regularly now, we do this over Skype, and it will be just as effective. And it's so much more accessible for families, as you can imagine, to not have to spend that time and spend that money coming down to see us. We spend quite a lot of time really looking at the disorder itself and trying to kind of pull out case series of different presentations so that we really understand the detail of those better and are able to work with them in just the best way possible. And we've written a paper, I've got references if anybody's interested later, we've written a paper quite recently on sexual obsessions in children and young people with OCD. We found that 25% of all the young people that we see come to us with sexual obsessions. And often, of course, the difficulty with this is the great taboo that they hold. So children and young people can have OCD for many, many years and never tell anyone what's really worrying them because they're so ashamed and embarrassed and might genuinely believe in these obsessions. So for instance, they might be worried that they're a paedophile or worried that they're in some way going to harm somebody sexually. I think if I tell somebody that, I'm going to be locked away and called a criminal. So just being able, again, to normalise that for families, hand them a journal paper and say, look, we know this many children and young people have this. It's a very normal presentation with an OCD. Is extremely helpful in treatment and also in teaching situations. We also come across some slightly more unusual presentations of OCD, one of which is listed here, transformation sessions. This is where children and young people, and it's also been identified in adults, called morphing disorder, is where they are fearful that they're going to turn into or become like something or somebody else. And you can appreciate that very often that gets misdiagnosed as psychosis. And in our case series, a number of the young people we saw with this presentation had indeed had that misdiagnosis and being treated for psychosis for many years before it was identified as OCD. The next two, I've got a couple of slides with a bit more details. So the low weight young people that we see, as you can imagine, it's very common to see young people with OCD who have actually lost weight. Again, sometimes they can be picked up and misdiagnosed as having anorexia nervosa, for instance. But actually, very often, OCD can be the driver for the loss of weight due to fear of contamination, so they restrict their eating, or perhaps due to a fear of getting ill, so they avoid things that they think are more likely to make them sick. Lots and lots of different reasons that can stop a young person with OCD from eating. So quite often we'll see young people who are really quite low weight and have been losing weight when we see them at assessment. But what we know, don't we, is that low weight has a big impact on CBT outcomes, and that somebody who is in a starved state is not cognitively in the right place to be doing CBT. So we've taken quite a clear stance on this now, that if we see children and young people who are less than 85% weight for height, then we actually say we're not able to do that treatment with you until that weight's gone back on. We have a kind of clear leaflet that documents that for people so that they know they've got to go away, and we will support them in getting that support for putting on the weight, and then they can come back and do their work with us. And you can see from that, just that small sample, a colleague of mine looked at some of the data on our young people. We just looked at 10 young people of a healthy weight and 10 underweight young people. And there's quite a dramatic difference there in the scores of their Cybox scores. So that's the measure of OCD I was mentioning earlier. So they're both groups started up at quite high, 29, approximately 28, 29 in the Cybox. It goes up to 40, by the way, but anything around 30 is really very severe and impairing. And at the end of treatment, the healthy weight young people had achieved 14, which is just above the cutoff for subclinical. And the underweight young people were still at 25 on the Cybox. So that's really quite a significant difference between those two groups. Obviously those were small numbers, but it's just an indication for us that we need to be really careful about who we offer the treatment to. The other very large group of young people that we see in our clinic is children and young people with autism spectrum disorder. Probably see about a third of all of our young people have that comorbidity. And we found over many years that the young people with ASD don't respond as quickly and as well to treatment. However, they do get some benefit from treatment. So we're continually sort of looking at that and thinking, well, what are the elements that they struggle more with, and how can we help that improve? So one thing in particular, the whole sort of psychoeducation around anxiety, they found that a lot harder, because we know that when people with ASD find it hard to understand emotions and their own feelings. So we've now extended that part in our treatment protocol for the young people with ASD. And we've also extended overall the number of treatment sessions they have. And we work particularly on generalisation of the improvements, because that's something that they were struggling with. So just before I finish, just two or three exciting innovations that we've got going on that are happening in the world of OCD and other disorders. So virtual reality is a big new development and is being used in quite a lot of anxiety disorders, but it can be used in OCD in particular quite usefully for sort of tailoring the environment to touch on the very specific fear that that young person has. So it's not always easy to set up an exposure task that really taps into that person's very specific fear. And the nearer it gets to their specific fear, the more effective it's going to be. So with virtual environments, you can do anything. So it's really quite exciting and something that our colleagues in the adult OCD service are also working with. The other thing, which kind of ties in a little bit with the telephone CBT, is that we're setting up and working on currently an internet CBT package. We're doing that in collaboration with our colleagues in Sweden at the Karolinska Institute. And obviously there's huge benefits of having an internet CBT package, again, in terms of accessibility, less therapist time needed. This is a bit different from the telephone, so it's not every week sessions with the therapist. You are actually doing the work on the internet, but you will have a little bit of telephone support from a psychologist, but a lot less time consuming for a psychologist than full-on one-to-one treatment. And then finally, one that I'm particularly interested in is I've been working with a group doing this. So this is something called multifamily group therapy, we are building on the work of Ivan Eisler, who's there in the picture. He's been working with children and adolescents with eating disorders for many years in this way, where he brings multiple families together. So we were doing this just last week. We have approximately sort of 6 or 7 families all in one room, quite daunting, but quite exciting. Because what happens is they really do start to support one another and sort of draw on all the issues that OCD can trigger around things like family accommodation of OCD. The way you see fathers, mothers, siblings all slaving away to kind of accommodate OCD. And when families get together and talk about that, it can be very, very empowering in their kind of fight against OCD and being able to stand up against it. They also talk about things like reassurance seeking, which is again a very powerful part of OCD, which affects parents and family members. So just bringing them together and working on these particular issues can be a real enhancer to CBT. It's not instead of, but it's a way of sort of adding on and trying to really create shifts in some of those very, very stuck families who just have been totally kind of dominated by OCD for many, many years. So as you can tell, that's something I'm quite passionate about. So that was all I have to say to you today, but I very much hope some of you will be coming along to the workshop on Thursday when we can go into assessment and treatment of OCD in a bit more detail. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chloe. That was really interesting. So we